The galactic chamber shimmered with cold light as billions across the stars tuned in. Daniel knelt in chains at the center, his breath shallow, each inhale echoing like a plea swallowed by silence. The alien judge loomed, voice metallic, declaring that humanity's record was one of violence and ruin. His words carried like thunder through the vaulted hall, condemning not only wars, but the very persistence of humanity. The chamber erupted in whispers, alien voices dripping with disdain. Daniel felt their eyes piercing his skin, branding him guilty before he could speak. "Humanity is not worthy of survival," the judge said, each syllable cutting like a blade. Daniel clenched his fists, his knuckles raw, his throat too dry to answer. The collaborator smirked from the stands, nodding along to the sentence as if it were strategy, not betrayal. Then, in the heavy silence, a whisper brushed Daniel's ear, soft as smoke. "They're not just judging you. They're judging us all." The words, unclaimed yet alive, cracked the chamber's stillness, planting the seed of something dangerous, defiance. Silence thickened as the sentence echoed through the chamber. Daniel's chest heaved, every breath sharp and uneven. He could almost hear humanity's heartbeat dying across distant stars. The judge's gaze pinned him like prey, while the collaborator smirked, as though victory was already written. The silent ally glanced down, sorrow flickering in her silver eyes. Daniel wanted to scream, to tear the silence apart, but his voice betrayed him. He knelt with dry lips and clenched teeth, hearing only the metallic chains that bound his body. The chamber itself seemed alive, feeding on his humiliation, on the spectacle of extinction declared before billions. Yet inside the choking silence, the echo of the whisper lingered. It refused to die. Its words swelled inside Daniel's mind like a spark buried deep beneath ash. His fear did not vanish, but it bent into something sharper, something heavier. For the first time, he realized this trial was not about him alone. The galaxy was watching, waiting to see if humanity would bow, or if survival itself would become rebellion. The alien judge raised his hand, and the entire chamber fell into stillness. His long fingers curled like talons around a glowing shard, a symbol of finality. Daniel's pulse hammered in his ears, as the shard pulsed with pale light. The judge's voice spread through the hall, condemning humanity's wars, greed, and restless hunger. His tone was not anger but disdain, as if the crimes were obvious truths. Daniel's fists tightened again. The accusations were twisted, fragments of history pulled from blood and smoke without context. The collaborator bowed his head as if the words were sacred. The crowd erupted in murmurs, some mocking, some chanting for annihilation. Daniel lifted his eyes, forcing himself to look into the judge's glowing stare. Fear coiled in his chest, but beneath it, another thought burned. This was not judgment. This was a performance staged to strip humanity of dignity before execution. And the whisper returned, feeding his resolve. "If they want to bury us, make them choke on the dust." Daniel's chains dragged across the polished stone floor as he shifted, the sound echoing like thunder in the chamber. The collaborator stepped forward, voice smooth and sharp, praising the judge's wisdom. He argued that survival through obedience was humanity's only chance, his words laced with venom, disguised as reason. Daniel's jaw tightened, rage boiling, but no voice came from him. The silent ally's gaze flickered again, subtle and restrained, though her silence said more than her lips ever could. The judge's expression never changed, his obsidian features frozen in disdain. Daniel's humiliation grew heavier, but so did the weight of defiance inside him. He realized the performance was not just for the judge, but for billions watching across the galaxy. Every word, every silence, every clink of his chains was fuel for the story of humanity's end. And yet, beneath the spectacle, something darker stirred, the sense of a hidden hand guiding the trial, unseen but relentless. The judge lowered the shard, finality etched into every movement. "Humanity will not see tomorrow," he said, his voice echoing into eternity. The chamber erupted, alien voices like a storm crashing over stone. Some shouted for blood, others for silence, but all agreed that humanity's time was over. Daniel's head hung low, his breath trembling in his chest. Yet within him, the whisper's echo swelled again, no longer faint but undeniable. He felt his humiliation bend into iron, his despair shaping into something dangerous. The silent ally lowered her head, sorrow burning in her gaze, while the collaborator smirked as though the execution was already complete. Daniel closed his eyes, chains heavy, body broken, but spirit alive. In that moment, as the galaxy screamed for extinction, a quiet thought anchored him. Survival itself would be rebellion. And rebellion had just begun. The cell was carved from cold stone, its walls glistening with moisture, as dim light seeped through a single fracture above. Daniel sat against the wall, chains still heavy on his wrists, breathing in the stale air of captivity. His body ached from restraint, but his mind burned brighter than before. Memories bled through the silence, his daughter's laughter once echoing across a ruined field, his brother's voice silenced by war. The scars across his arms pulsed, each mark a memory of battles survived. He whispered to himself, "I am not their chosen one. I am what's left." The words tasted bitter, yet they anchored him. He knew the court had chosen him because he seemed broken, because his scars told a story of defeat. But even broken steel could cut deep. As he pressed his forehead against the cold stone, he felt the whisper again, its weight heavier now. "Your scars are their fear." He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the silence became armor instead of chains. The night dragged like eternity. Daniel traced the rust on his shackles with trembling fingers, his eyes locked on the crack of light above. Sleep evaded him, hunted by visions of war's aftermath. He remembered a battlefield of twisted iron and smoke, where humanity's cries drowned under fire. His body carried pieces of that memory, etched in scars no tribunal could erase. His lips cracked as he whispered, "You can take my voice, but not what it carries." The chamber of memory opened wider, showing faces of those lost. A friend's betrayal, a lover's sacrifice, the child he could not protect. Each memory flayed him open, yet each tightened his resolve. The galaxy wanted to see weakness, but weakness had long burned away, leaving embers of defiance. Daniel leaned back, eyes fixed on the crack above. A faint spark of starlight shone through, as if the universe itself had not abandoned him. He smiled faintly, not in joy, but in defiance. Morning in the chamber came with no warmth, only judgment. Guards dragged Daniel back into the tribunal hall, chains biting into his wrists. He stumbled yet refused to bow his head. The collaborators stood proudly near the judge, speaking in tones slick with false honor. He claimed that humanity was doomed not by alien cruelty, but by its own corruption. Daniel listened, jaw tight, refusing to grant satisfaction with reaction. His silence was its own rebellion. Among the crowd, the silent Allah's gaze brushed his, soft but fleeting, a flicker of quiet strength in a storm of contempt. Daniel's scars itched beneath the chains, each one whispering survival. The judge's glowing eyes narrowed, as though trying to pierce his silence and drag weakness from him. But silence had become Daniel's weapon, and the galaxy would see it. In every breath, in every scar, he carried the story of survival written in flesh. The judge unfurled a scroll of light, images flickering across the chamber, burning cities, broken bodies, rivers of ash. Each was cast as humanity's legacy. Daniel's lips parted, but no defense left him. The crowd hissed and jeered, their voices drowning him before he could speak. The collaborator raised his hand, agreeing with the judge, claiming these crimes were undeniable truth. Daniel's fists trembled, but his eyes sought the silent ally once more. She met his gaze, her sorrow heavy, her silence dangerous. Daniel breathed slowly, realizing this was not evidence but theater. The crimes were real, but bent, twisted, stripped of context. His scars pulsed, not as shame, but as proof. Every mark was survival. Every wound was defiance. His silence broke only when he whispered through clenched teeth, unheard by most. "You fear what refuses to die." The words belonged not to the court, but to the billions watching beyond. When the images faded, silence swallowed the chamber once more. Daniel's chest heaved, as if carrying centuries of blame alone. The judge's eyes glowed brighter, pressing the weight of extinction upon him. The collaborator folded his arms, smug, convinced humanity had been buried. Yet the silence stretched too long, heavy and uneasy. The silent Allah's gaze lingered, her silver eyes flickering with unspoken warning. Daniel lowered his head, not in surrender but in resolve, every scar on his body telling a story of battles survived, of lives endured. He whispered again, voice raw, "They fear us because we endure." The words, almost lost in the vast chamber, carried like embers into the silence. For the first time, some among the crowd fell quiet, their disdain unsettled. The chamber's stillness trembled with something new, not victory, not submission, but the first crack of rebellion seated in silence. The tribunal chamber dimmed as new images ignited across its walls. Burning forests, poisoned rivers, and endless wars blazed into view, each one framed as humanity's curse. Daniel stood shackled at the center, the spotlight scorching his face. The alien judge's voice thundered, "Your species has fed on fire and ashes." His words struck like hammers, meant to silence, not to question. Daniel's jaw tightened, rage biting at his silence. He saw twisted truths woven into lies, history sliced apart to frame only destruction. The collaborator stepped forward, his voice smooth, declaring, "Humanity condemns itself through its deeds." The crowd erupted in cheers, as though justice had been achieved. Daniel's fists clenched, blood seeping from his wrists where chains cut deep. His heart thundered, but his silence grew heavier, carrying weight the judge could not crush. He whispered inside his mind, not yet aloud, that truth was buried, but not lost. The chamber's air burned with accusation. Daniel raised his head, lips parting, but his words were drowned by the crowd's jeers. The judge's glowing eyes narrowed, relishing his silence as guilt. The collaborator smirked, stepping closer, pointing at Daniel with cruel satisfaction. "Even his silence admits guilt," he said, his voice loud and clear. Daniel's teeth ground together, his muscles trembling, yet he refused to break. He realized the court was not seeking truth. It was building theater, crafting a story to bury his kind. Shadows flickered along the chamber walls, twisting with each image of destruction. Among the chaos, Daniel's eyes found the silent ally again. Her gaze lingered longer, sorrow flickering but unspoken, a spark of truth buried under fear. Daniel clenched his fists harder, chains rattling like drums of defiance. His silence was not surrender, it was resistance carved in steel. Another wave of images filled the chamber, this time twisted beyond recognition. Footage of massacres where human soldiers were replaced with false faces, crimes pinned with forged evidence. Daniel's eyes widened, his chest tightening with disbelief. The judge declared, "Your crimes are endless." The collaborator echoed the words like a shadow. Daniel whispered through clenched teeth, "Lies." The word was swallowed by the uproar, but his fury spread across his scars like fire. He knew now the tribunal was a stage, its evidence woven from truth and fabrication. He understood their goal was not judgment, but extermination disguised as law. The crowd roared louder, blinded by the spectacle, but Daniel felt clarity in the storm. For the first time, the chains on his wrists felt less like prison, and more like proof of survival. He was no longer defending himself, he was resisting their script. The chamber fell into momentary silence, tension sharp as glass. Daniel's chest rose and fell, his eyes locked on the judge. He forced his voice out, hoarse but steady. "These are not truths, they are weapons." The words silenced the chamber for a heartbeat, before chaos returned. The judge's obsidian hand slammed against the podium, his voice slicing through. "Silence. You have no voice here." The collaborator sneered, shouting that Daniel's words were poison. Yet, in that instant, some among the crowd hesitated, their chants faltering. Daniel felt it. The ripple of doubt carried beyond the chamber, into billions of watching eyes. His chains cut deeper into his wrists, but his spirit stretched higher. His silence had become a weapon, but his words, though brief, had struck like fire. The judge's gaze hardened, yet beneath the fury, Daniel sensed unease. Truth was cracking their performance. That night, Daniel was returned to his cell, his body aching, his mind a battlefield. The chains dug into his skin, but his heart pounded with a new clarity. He sat against the cold wall, whispering to the silence, "They want extinction, not justice." His words echoed softly, yet they felt like a vow. The shadows deepened, stretching across the cell like living things. Then, from the corner, a voice emerged, not his own. It was quiet, steady, and filled with knowing. "If you want the truth, you must survive what comes tomorrow." Daniel's breath caught, his eyes darting into the darkness, searching for the speaker. But the corner held only shadows, shifting like smoke. The whisper lingered in the air, weaving into his chest like a thread of steel. He closed his eyes, and for the first time he felt not despair but readiness. Tomorrow would not be survival, it would be war. Dawn rose over the tribunal hall, not with light but with cruelty. Daniel was dragged to a new chamber, vast and circular, where the floor shifted like living stone. The judge's voice thundered, "Your trial is not finished. You will endure what no species could." Chains clattered as guards forced him onto the shifting ground, each step threatening collapse. Daniel's chest heaved, every scar pulling tight, every muscle screaming. The crowd leaned forward, eyes hungry for spectacle. The collaborators smiled, whispering to those near him that Daniel would fall quickly. Yet as the floor cracked, Daniel planted his feet, refusing to bow. Pain was not new, it had been his companion for years. The ordeal was not meant to measure guilt, but to prove humanity's weakness. Daniel gritted his teeth and thought, "If this is their justice, then survival is my defiance." The trial had become an execution staged as theater, and he would not give them collapse. The floor cracked further, splitting into jagged platforms. Daniel stumbled, chains rattling, but caught himself with bleeding palms. Gasps rippled through the crowd, expecting collapse, yet he remained upright. The judge's obsidian features remained unreadable, but the collaborator leaned forward, eager to witness failure. Daniel's breath came heavy, each inhale dragging fire through his chest. He remembered a battlefield where the ground had collapsed beneath him once before, and he had crawled through fire to live. His scars burned with memory, but memory gave strength. The chamber pulsed with shifting light, casting him in flickering shadows like a figure carved in defiance. Daniel thought, "You wanted me broken. Instead, you will see me endure." The ordeal twisted against him, yet every step he took turned their weapon into proof. The crowd's jeers faltered, their certainty cracking as Daniel refused to fall. From above, heavy shards of stone descended, designed to crush and break. Daniel raised his arms, chains scraping his skin as he dodged the first strike. Dust filled the chamber, choking his lungs. The judge's voice carried, "Weakness cannot be hidden." The collaborator laughed, convinced this was the end. But Daniel's body twisted with painful grace, moving not with strength but with desperation, refined by years of survival. His knees buckled, yet he forced them steady, pushing past the agony. Each scar on his body became a roadmap of endurance, guiding him through torment. Among the chaos, the silent Allah's silver eyes glimmered, reflecting sorrow and something more, admiration. Daniel spat blood onto the stone and stood again. He whispered into the dust, "You fear what rises when it should fall." His defiance turned the ordeal into proof that humanity's strength was not conquest but survival against all ruin. The ordeal escalated. Spears of light erupted from the floor, searing heat burning against Daniel's skin. He staggered but kept moving, each step marked by defiance. The crowd roared, some with glee, others with disbelief. The judge's eyes glowed brighter, cold fury crackling within them. The collaborator whispered to those near him, See how stubbornness only prolongs death. But Daniel's heart pounded like a drum, refusing surrender. Every scar screamed yet carried him forward. The chamber shook with the force of his survival, each motion a rejection of extinction. Daniel lifted his head, blood dripping from his lip, and locked eyes with the judge. His silence was no longer humiliation, it was defiance spoken without words. The silent ally lowered her gaze, not in shame but in dangerous sympathy. Daniel's body was breaking, but his spirit had become unbreakable steel. The ordeal had failed to crush what they most feared, his refusal to die. The ordeal ended not with victory, but with revelation. Daniel collapsed to one knee, chest heaving, chains smoking from searing heat. Yet, he was alive. The chamber fell into uneasy silence. The collaborator's smirk faltered for the first time, unease flickering across his face. The judge stared, his obsidian features unreadable, yet his silence betrayed calculation. Daniel raised his head slowly, sweat dripping, eyes burning with fury and resolve. Then came the betrayal. From the shadows, Michael, once Daniel's trusted friend, stepped forward. His voice cut cold. This was never about justice. It was about fear. Daniel's eyes widened, breath catching, the weight of betrayal sharper than chains. Michael's smile was cruel, polished, his eyes devoid of regret. In that moment, Daniel understood. The trial was a conspiracy, orchestrated not to judge but to destroy. His scars had made him dangerous, and his survival had made him a threat. Daniel stood bloodied, chains heavy, yet his back unbroken. The judge announced the ordeal complete, voice cold and absolute. The chamber waited for collapse, but Daniel's eyes lifted to the billions watching. His silence cracked, replaced by words that carried like thunder. "You call us violent," he said, his voice hoarse, "but you forget sacrifice." He spoke of mothers shielding children, of brothers who bled for strangers, of hands that built hope from ruins. The crowd stirred, murmurs breaking through jeers. The collaborator hissed that his words were lies, but Daniel's voice gained weight. Each syllable carved into the chamber walls like defiance made flesh. He spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor, and survival itself was rebellion. The silent owl's gaze brightened with dangerous sympathy, while the judge's eyes narrowed, fury masked by stone. Daniel's chains rattled with each word, but their sound no longer meant prison. They echoed like drums of war. The chamber filled with unease as Daniel's voice grew stronger. He told of fields burned yet replanted, of children laughing in ruins, of humanity's relentless return after every fall. His words pierced deeper than any weapon. The judge slammed his hand, demanding silence, but the echo only fed Daniel's momentum. "We are not asking for mercy," he said, breath ragged. "We are demanding recognition." The collaborator shouted for guards to silence him, but hesitation rippled through the chamber. Some aliens shifted, their contempt faltering as doubt crept in. Daniel's eyes blazed, his face cut and scarred, yet alive with fire. He carried not just his pain, but the voices of countless forgotten. Every chain was proof. Every scar was history carved in flesh. The hall trembled with the weight of his words. No longer a trial but a broadcast of rebellion to every corner of the galaxy. Daniel's words struck deeper when he revealed what the tribunal feared most. Legacy. "I am not just one," he said, his voice breaking yet rising. "I carry blood that once charted stars, hands that lit the first fires." His words were more than defiance. They were revelation. The collaborator paled, his smugness cracking, whispering that Daniel's survival itself was a threat. The judge's gaze hardened, yet unease flickered in the glow of his eyes. Daniel raised his chained wrists, blood dripping down his arms, as if to display survival itself as proof of power. The crowd shifted, some voices trembling, others rising in outrage. Among them, the silent owl's silver eyes glimmered brighter, filled with dangerous hope. Daniel's chest heaved, each breath a battle, but his words cut into the galaxy like blades. The trial was no longer judgment, It had become revolution born in chains. The storm broke when a blast shook the chamber. From the shadows, the innocent appeared, Anna, fragile, altered by alien hands, yet her eyes still human. She stepped forward, voice trembling but pure. "He does not stand alone." Gasps filled the hall as she shielded Daniel from a guard's strike, her body fragile but unyielding. Daniel's breath caught, his chest searing with memory and pain. He cried, "Anna!" But her gaze held steady, filled with quiet defiance. The judge's face darkened, fury erupting like fire. The collaborator hissed that she was corrupted, but the crowd faltered, their voices trembling. Anna's sacrifice cracked the performance, revealing truth through innocence. Daniel's scars burned with memory, but now his chains carried her defiance too. Her act ignited the spark he had planted. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time it trembled. Chaos erupted. The chamber trembled with shouts, some demanding death, others crying for justice. The judge roared, voice filled with fury, but his command fractured under the weight of rebellion spreading like fire. Daniel fell to his knees beside Anna, his chains rattling, his blood mixing with hers. His voice rose again, stronger, fueled by her sacrifice. "You cannot bury us. We rise in fire, in ruin, in memory. We endure." His words carried like a storm, igniting riots across factions watching the trial. The collaborator shouted desperately, his face twisted in fear, while the silent ally bowed her head, silver eyes shining with tears. Daniel lifted Anna's hand, her breath faint, but her defiance immortal. The galaxy had been infected, not with weakness, but with humanity's defiance. The trial had become a spark, and that spark had become fire. The judge's verdict fell like iron. Extermination. Guards seized Daniel, dragging him forward, chains biting deep into his flesh. The chamber roared with chaos. Some alien factions demanded execution, their voices sharp as blades, while others shouted in protest, their tones trembling with dissent. The collaborator raised his hands, shouting over the storm, declaring humanity's end inevitable. Yet his voice was lost amid the swelling uproar. Daniel stumbled, his knees striking the stone floor, but he lifted his head. His eyes locked with the crowd, not with plea, but with fury. His voice cut through the storm, rough but unyielding. "You cannot erase us." The silent owl's silver gaze lingered, her silence louder than any protest. The chamber became a battlefield of voices, no longer united in condemnation. What had begun as judgment was now rebellion spreading like wildfire across the galaxy. Daniel's body sagged under the weight of his chains, yet his spirit burned. He turned his gaze to the judge, voice hoarse but defiant. "You fear us because we endure." The judge's obsidian features darkened, his glowing eyes blazing with fury. The collaborator screamed that Daniel's words were poison, demanding silence, yet doubt spread like cracks in glass. The silent ally finally spoke, her voice low yet piercing. "Justice does not silence truth." The chamber fell still for a heartbeat, stunned by her defiance. Daniel breathed raggedly, his chest rising like a drumbeat of rebellion. The uproar rose again, but this time fractured, voices no longer united in hatred. The trial had splintered the galaxy's illusion of control. What had been staged as extermination had transformed into something uncontrollable, an infection of defiance that no decree could silence. The collaborator stepped forward, his polished uniform gleaming under harsh light, his face twisted in rage. "He corrupts you," he shouted, pointing at Daniel. "Humanity is a disease." But his words faltered against the storm of voices. Some in the crowd rose, demanding that humanity be spared, while others howled for blood. Daniel stood taller despite his chains, his face smeared with blood and defiance. He shouted to the galaxy, "We are not your disease, we are your reflection." The chamber shook as opposing factions clashed, fists slamming against stone, voices echoing across stars. The judge's hand rose, but even his command failed to restore control. Daniel's words had split the galaxy, planting fire in places long thought silent. His defiance was no longer his own. It had become a contagion spreading faster than judgment. Daniel was dragged toward the execution platform, the chains cutting into his skin, leaving trails of blood across the stone. The judge's voice thundered, "End this!" Guards raised weapons, ready to strike. Yet the chamber erupted again, shouts of dissent, cries for justice, voices rising against the decree. The silent ally stepped forward, her silver eyes blazing, whispering words to the crowd that carried like fire. Fear is not justice. The collaborators' face twisted in desperation, screaming for order, but order was gone. Daniel lifted his chin, his voice raw but steady. "You cannot bury what refuses to die." His words echoed louder than the judge's command, carried across the stars by billions watching. The execution was no longer spectacle, it had become revolution. The tribunal dissolved into chaos. Alien factions clashed in the stands, some defending the decree, others defying it. Daniel stood bleeding, chains rattling, but his voice cut through the storm. "We are already inside you, in your fear, your memory, your fire." His words spread like sparks across the galaxy, igniting riots, rebellions, and cries for freedom. The judge's fury burned, but even his command could not extinguish the contagion. The collaborator's voice cracked in desperation, drowned by the crowd. The silent owl's gaze lingered on Daniel, her sorrow heavy, yet her silence now a shield. Daniel closed his eyes, every scar throbbing, but his spirit alive with defiance. The verdict had been delivered, but its meaning had been shattered. What was meant as extermination had become infection. Humanity's survival was no longer in question. It had already spread like fire. The tribunal chamber burned with division, its once unshakable authority fractured. Daniel stood bleeding, his chains heavy, but his spirit unbroken. The judge's command echoed hollow, drowned by the voices of factions rising in defiance. Anna's faint breath lingered in his memory, her sacrifice etched into his chest. Daniel whispered to himself, "Her fire will not die with her." The silent ally's silver gaze followed him, sorrow shadowing her face, but beneath it glowed defiance. The collaborator shouted into the storm, but his voice had become irrelevant. Daniel lifted his chin, no longer pleading for mercy, but standing as humanity's warning. Daniel was dragged from the chamber into the pale corridors of the tribunal. His body trembled with exhaustion, but his steps remained steady. Guards pulled at his chains, yet he walked upright, eyes fixed forward. Outside, alien factions clashed in the streets, their cries carried through the walls like thunder. Daniel heard them, and for the first time, he felt humanity was no longer alone. The judge's sentence had not ended humanity. It had infected the galaxy with rebellion. Daniel whispered to the silence, "You wanted ashes, but now you breathe our fire." His scars pulsed with every step, his body carrying not just survival but prophecy. The collaborator approached, his uniform pristine despite the storm, his face strained with fury. "You doomed us all," he hissed, his voice trembling. Daniel turned his head slowly, eyes filled with fire. "No," he answered, his words sharp as steel, "I gave them the truth." The collaborator's confidence cracked, his eyes shifting with unease, his power fading in the shadow of rebellion. Daniel's scars bled anew, but his spirit stood taller. What had been designed as a display of human weakness had revealed humanity's greatest strength. The collaborator fell back, his voice drowned by the growing roar of rebellion outside. The silent ally stepped closer, her silver eyes gleaming, her voice soft but resolute. "Your survival is their fear," she whispered, a truth wrapped in sorrow. Daniel met her gaze, his breath unsteady, his heart carrying both gratitude and grief. He knew she could not save him, but her words were more powerful than rescue. They were recognition, acknowledgement that humanity had carved a scar into the galaxy. Daniel whispered back, "Then let them remember the scar." Guards pulled him away, yet the moment lingered, unshakable. In her gaze, Daniel saw not pity but respect. Humanity had been spared, but never forgiven. Outside the tribunal, the galaxy burned with unrest. Fires of rebellion lit skies across countless worlds, and Daniel stood beneath the pale starlight, his body broken but alive. He walked slowly, every scar a testament to endurance, every breath a refusal to die. The crowd stared, stunned into silence. Humanity had not been erased, it had been transformed into warning. Daniel's voice, low but steady, carried into the night. They wanted a verdict. What they got was a warning. His chains clinked with each step, echoing like prophecy across the stars. The trial was over, but the fire it lit would never fade.